organization is as only good as its leaders. This is the case for business, for politics, for any category that you can truly think of. And this is, of course, the case for universities. And whether we talk about that in terms of them as a community functionality, as a business, as a sports producing program, as an academic institution, you're only as good as your leaders. Auburn has had many great leaders over the years in many capacities, but ultimately they all answer to one person, and that is the university president, the Auburn president. Over the past decade, it's been pretty interesting watching the trajectory of this office as it's gone through some ups and downs, not necessarily good or bad, but what's gotten to this point in the beginning of a new era at Auburn University is interesting to kind of recount and look forward to the future. And that's what I want to do today, is look forward to the future of our leadership at Auburn University, but also recounting the past, especially the past decade. That's what we're getting into here on Ever to Podcast, which is our short form audio and video podcast series where we dive into the news and the topical conversation that's important right now to the Auburn family. Whether you're listening to us on podcast or you're watching here on YouTube, we appreciate you spending some time with us. And if you haven't, please do make sure that you're subscribed on either or both those formats so you don't miss any content that we're putting out exclusively on either of those different formats. Back to the topic at hand that I appreciate you tuning in to hear my thoughts on today. And I'll be interested to talk about this one because honestly, this one has a little bit of a personal ring to it for me for several reasons. Obviously, I'm invested in Auburn University. Obviously, Auburn sports, but the university as a whole, the town, the whole of the Auburn culture. We talk a lot about the whole of the Auburn experience. And yes, that extends even to who our leaders are at Auburn. As I said on Monday, May 16th, Chris Roberts became the new president of Auburn University, replacing Dr. Jay Goosh in his second term, who replaced Dr. Steven Leath, who replaced the first term, Dr. Jay Goosh. And that's over the past decade plus that we've had this group of leaders bringing us, the sports, the academics, everything that goes into the Auburn experience, being the face of an institution that we are all super fond of. The personal effect for me is because my president, because I graduated during this time frame, was Dr. Jay Goosh. As we called him affectionately, the Goosh. Every time he would enter a building, when we were at our graduation, he gave a big Goosh out there, and affectionately, because he was someone that we all, for the most part, I would assume, based off what I thought of him and what my circles thought about him, as a great representative and a great leader of Auburn. And so it is sad a second time to see that tenure officially end at Auburn, but I do think, as we'll talk about in summarizing all this, for the better. And we'll also look ahead to Chris Roberts at what he can potentially do for Auburn and why this might be a great fit. And yes, we will always bring this back to sports. Promise you of that here on this channel and on this podcast. Now, let's take a step back for just a second and kind of talk about the beginnings of all this. And no, I'm not going to take you back through countless years of Auburn University history, of presidents, bygone, past, all that stuff. We're really talking about this group because it's really what has defined, especially over the last decade plus, what Auburn has become, and seen a lot of change, whether you think that's good or bad, over the past decade. We'll start with Dr. Jay Goosh. If I've got my numbers correct, look this up before we started recording here. 2007 is when his tenure officially began at Auburn. For me, as someone who was just really beginning to have Auburn as an option, I graduated from high school in 2005. I really wasn't thinking about presidents back then. But through what the university has been through in that time, athletically, academically, as I said before, good and bad wise, You would think now that you would be more cognizant of that, but me as a young college guy just wanting to get to Auburn, it was the least thing from my mind. Dr. Gouge is the one I said that I walked across the stage, and he's the one who didn't hand me the diploma. That was the provost, I believe, and shook my hand, and I have a picture of me shaking Dr. Gouge's hand. So that's why it's important to me, because he is the guy who I have that photo with, signifying that that piece of paper that I have hung up on a wall means something, and it's real, and it's official, because this guy is the one that approved it. It's his name on it. That's why it means so much to me. When you think about sports in this time as well, he really did start seeing the transition from an old guard, I don't want to call it, but to a new, more modern Auburn athletics program as we like to think about it. I mean, if you think about during this time, he brought Gene Chizik in, he brought Gus Malzahn eventually, and effectively, because he was here during this time, brought Coach Harsin. So he really has had his hand in every bit of the football program. He oversaw, if, again, I've got my dates correct, the bringing in of Barbie, the eventual bringing in of Coach Pearl, and the securing of Coach Pearl for basketball in that sense. He's also seen the tenures extended and maintained for some of our most stalwart names in Auburn athletics. Coach Ralph Spry at track and field, who's now going to be ending his time with us after so many years. Coach Karen Hoppe. And he's seen his fair share of those coaching hires, those programs, their states, having great moments. But he's also been involved when there's been, we'll call them quote-unquote scandals, when there's been not so great times in terms of success on the field or even off the field. Jay Gouge has had his hand in about everything. But I think when you look at the most part of it, you'll probably look and see, hey, this guy, for the most part, led us in a great way, even through some of the more difficult times. If you think about it, he went through the poisoning of the Tumors Oak trees with us. And I know that seems trivial to some folks, but for a lot of us, that's a big thing. It was during my time as a student. Led us through, other tragedies and other low moments. And that's what a leader really is. Someone who leads us through the highs and the lows and does it to the best of their ability. Not always being perfect, maybe sometimes making mistakes, but doing it to the best of their ability. I do want to recount a little bit about Dr. Steven Leath. And while I don't want to sit here and disparage anybody who can't defend themselves, but I think it's a fair statement to say that the short tenure of Dr. Steven Leath here was probably one that not a lot of people look fondly upon. There was some tumultuousness with athletics during that time. There were coaches that were let go. There were coaches that were people believe should have been let go sooner and were secure during that time. We can debate that back and forth all we want. One of the more controversial things that I remember, and can't remember when I was discussing this on our podcast network, if it was his directive or he was just involved in it, but there was an attempt to change the logo for Auburn to make it more cohesively succinct. And in all reality, it probably wasn't exactly him leading that charge, but it definitely was under his tenure. And it definitely was under his leadership. And I remember how badly that failed and how much backlash there was. It was an interesting time. You think Auburn Twitter is fun now? I remember back when the logo was, and that wasn't too far. I say that like I'm some old geezer, but that was an interesting couple of days and weeks when that became a reality on social media and how much people hated the potential change of Auburn's iconic A and U interlocking look and trying to take away some of that, they call it negative space that's there that kind of makes it hard for branding and stuff like that. But thankfully, that did not change, at least from my perspective. Dr. Steven Leath, I think there's always been this interesting thing with Iowa State that for some reason we go get these guys, the president, former coach, Gene Chizik, doesn't really end well with them, does it? Which makes it even more ironic because we just got a transfer defensive back from Iowa State. Craig McDonald, made a little joke about him. We did a video about that recently if you want to go check that out on YouTube. And, hopefully he can buck the trend of people leaving Iowa State and coming to Auburn. And hopefully his tenure here as a defensive back ends much better than Coach Gene Chizik's did, even though he got a championship out of it, and Dr. Steven Leath did as well. When he got here, it's one of those things where a lot of people liked the pick because it was something outside the norm. It wasn't, an Auburn person. But I think, as I'll get to when we talk about Chris Roberts, that was probably where the biggest mistake was, is that there is some degree of, whether it's in athletics, academics, or just leadership in whole, when it's involved with Auburn stuff, you kind of need to have someone that's got Auburn ties. And I know a lot of people don't agree with that. But I think when you look back, the ones that have at least some tie to us are usually the most successful. Usually. Not always the case. We can look back to examples like Pat Dye, right, in football, who did not have any ties to Auburn outside of being a Georgia guy and having that relationship between Auburn and Georgia. So there are exceptions to that rule, but by and large, having someone that's connected with the university, the people, is what really succeeds. Dr. Steven Leath moves on. Jay Gush thankfully comes in and just gets us through some tough times and gets us to the point where we start finding someone to lead us. And that is, as we know now, Dr. Chris Roberts, dean of one of the schools of engineering. I'm not going to sit here and say what exactly one, or if it was over all of engineering. Probably should have had that ready in my mind, but a lot of things to remember on all these fronts, dates and all that kind of stuff. But a dean in a very prominent and important role here at Auburn University. So when we talk about, is this the right fit for Auburn, there's definitely some angles that you can attack it from. And we'll always bring it back to sports here, but let's start with some of the academic side. Engineering is what Auburn is known for, at least one of the big academic things that they're known for. So it makes sense to get somebody aligned with what school has the most prominence for you, brings in the most money for you, and that's the engineering schools. Makes the most sense. From that checks a box right there. I go back to somebody who needs to be some sort of alignment or allegiance with Auburn. Doesn't have to be the quintessential Auburn guy. Doesn't have to have played on a team here. Doesn't have to, even have graduated here. But as Pat Dye has said, and statements from him before he passed away, that Auburn was who I was, and I just didn't know it until I got to know it. So that's kind of what I feel like with Dr. Chris Roberts. This is a guy that didn't graduate from Auburn, but has been here since 1993, I believe, and has stayed here and become part of the community, the people. And I think that's going to be an incredible fit for Auburn, because it's someone with outside experience, outside perspectives, but has spent enough time here to know what makes us tick, to know what pisses us off, to know what makes us happy, and to know and understand that as much as a lot of us talk about it valuing the whole of the Auburn experience, that it always comes back to the sports. It does. Football is king. Sports are king. It's just the fact of the matter. It's your biggest marketing arm of the university, and someone who understands that and someone who appreciates that is what I think we're going to find in Chris Roberts. I don't know Chris personally. Hopefully one day we'll get a chance to meet, maybe even interview him. But what I have been told through people that I've discussed Chris with, I say Chris like we're on a name, Dr. Roberts with, is that different walks of life too. Students, people who are actually faculty, people who have met him personally. Every account that I've heard is what a nice guy he is, how much he loves Auburn, and how much he wants to see this university succeed, not just where it's at now, but be better in all aspects. And if you listen to some of his remarks today in videos they put out, that's what he echoed. Imagining, I can't remember the exact slogan, but imagining beyond where we are now and where Auburn could be. So that's what I see in Dr. Chris Roberts, an Auburn guy who learned that that's what he was meant to be a part of, with outside perspective, that values the sports and what that means to it, but is also going to support some of our strongest academic departments and schools that we have. And I think that's going to be a huge asset for Auburn, and hopefully will be a long tenure here at Auburn. Now, again, I don't want to disparage Dr. Leath, but with the short time and the way things kind of moved off from him, I'm going to just kind of push that tenure to the side. But I do want to sit here and thank Dr. Jay Gush. You were my president. I thank you for shaking my hand and letting me usher in a new chapter of my life, and you will always be the guy that led the university and in some ways the people that I love so much. Thank you, Dr. Gooch. Dr. Chris Roberts, thank you for choosing us, for continuing to be a part of us, and for being willing to spend now the rest of maybe your days, your working days, as our leader and trying to get us to be the best that we can be and beyond in athletics, in academics, as a community, and as a family. So I'd like to welcome formally Dr. Chris Roberts as our new president, and we look forward to how your leadership will bring us to new heights as an Auburn family. That's our thoughts for this topic today here on Ever to Podcast. Again, if you listen on podcast format or you're watching here on YouTube, we do appreciate you hanging out with us and sharing it out on social media, and maybe even subscribing on either format or both if you haven't. So do share your thoughts on the comment section here on YouTube, or you can share your thoughts on the post on social media if you listened on the podcast app. Thank you for tuning in today. Until we talk again to share more of the Auburn experience with you, War Eagle.